Eighth graders, how are you doing? Happy weekend. Hope you're all doing well. I'm going to be doing a screencast today that is designed in part to quickly review some of the stuff that you learned about over the course of this past week, and also to preview what you'll be learning about as your focus this week. And that's pretty well indicated here in the heading you see: America and Germany, World War One to the stock market crash of 1929. There's a lot about World War One that we're not doing that we would have done had we been in school. I will recommend a movie if you're interested. The movie All Quiet on the Western Front. It's a 1930 film. It's very old. It's black and white. There are some aspects of the film that aren't great, but it does give you a good visual sense of certain aspects of World War One, especially trench warfare. That movie does a really admirable job of giving you a sense of what it was like to live in World War One trenches and fight in World War One trenches. Just a little recommendation if you are interested. All Quiet on the Western Front. If you did the work this week, you know a little bit about World War One and America's involvement in it. And in the war, the United States was primarily uh, fighting against Germany. There's a little bit of a background here that explains America's involvement in World War One, and it primarily involves what you see on the screen: the German U-boats. The Germans during World War One had the best submarine fleet in the world. They really were ahead of the rest of the world. Their subs could do two things better than other countries' subfleets. They could go deeper, and they could stay underwater longer. That made them especially effective, and they couldn't be detected because in World War One, the kind of technology that you would use to detect and then destroy a submarine didn't exist yet. So good submarines could be lethal in the open water. And during World War One, before the United States got in, Germany was attacking ships, including passenger ships. This is a picture of a New York Times headline from 1915 about the sinking of a ship called the Lusitania. It was a British passenger ship that had Americans aboard. And this caused outrage in the United States. It was the beginning of the process of Americans turning against Germany. And although America would not enter the war for another couple of years, that has increased tensions between the two countries. By the time the United States was in the war, there was an aggressive effort on the part of the American government to promote America's war effort. And part of that was the use of things like this: propaganda posters that painted the Germans as the bad guys. You can see in this picture, you can see this pointed helmet here is the helmet of the German army. And the German soldier here is presented as a big, menacing gorilla, and what he's got is sort of liberty and freedom in the form of a woman here, in his arms, kind of a damsel in distress. And the message of posters like this is, they're coming to get you, and so you need to enlist. This is an enlistment poster for the U.S. Army. Enlist so that you can help destroy this mad brute. So America, once it was in the war, aggressively um, tried to get support for America's war effort. The president during World War One and immediately afterward was this guy, Woodrow Wilson. He was elected in 1912, and he would serve two terms, although he had a stroke in 1919, served out the last year of his presidency in very poor physical shape. He was the American president during the war. He initially tried to keep America out, reluctantly got America in, and then after the war, attempted to guide the peace process. And you're going to learn a little bit about that this week. And the way that he tried to do that, I'm going to explain in a second. But I want to give you a sense of Woodrow Wilson's philosophy. And this comes from his war declaration speech in 1917, where Woodrow Wilson said, "We shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest to our hearts: for democracy, for the rights of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations, for a concert of free peoples as shall bring peace and safety to all nations and make the world itself at last free." Wilson tried to elevate the meaning of the war, which when America entered the war was already shaping up to be the bloodiest in history. So he's trying to here present a goal for the war that would be one that people would see as worth fighting for democracy, for freedom, to make the world free, to make the world safe. very noble goals. And at the end of the war, Woodrow Wilson would try to bring that to reality. Woodrow Wilson put forward this peace plan in 1918 called the 14 Points Peace Plan. And part of the 14 points was, among other things, to get all nations of the world to reduce their size of their militaries, to get nations to agree to work cooperatively. He put forward what would become eventually the United Nations, although at the time the idea that he proposed was to create something called the League of Nations, an international organization that would be committed to preserving peace. World War I ends in November of 1918. It was actually November 11th was the day that fighting ended. In America, we observe that day as Veterans Day. In Britain, they observe it as what is called Armistice Day. It's a holiday commemorating the end of World War I. There would then be a peace conference in 1919 where all the major powers would get together to try to hammer out a permanent peace agreement. And the goal, or at least what they hoped the goal would be to prevent a future war. Let's end this war and set some conditions that will prevent a future war. As you're going to learn this week, Woodrow Wilson thought that that would be achieved by all countries learning to cooperate with each other as sort of international, spirit of international cooperation. But other countries said the way you ensure future peace is by reducing Germany's power to ever wage war again. That will result in what is famously known as the Treaty of Versailles. So what you see here pictured here, this is a picture of the palace at Versailles, about an hour outside of Paris, France. If you've ever been to France, you may have been to Versailles before. This is here one of the most famous rooms in the palace called the Hall of Mirrors. And this was the place chosen for what is called the signing ceremony, where all the major powers would sign the treaty that it would officially end the war. There's a lot of stuff in this treaty. What's important to know right now, for the sake of what you're going to be learning this week, is that Germany was forced in the treaty to accept blame for the war. Forgive my typo there. That should say Germany forced to accept the blame for war, not war. But they're forced to take the blame, and they're being asked to pay a lot of money back to the victorious Allies. This is going to create a lot of anger inside of Germany, and is going to lead in Germany to the rise of a bunch of organizations that are made up of angry war veterans from Germany. One of those organizations is the National Socialist German Workers' Party, more famously known as the Nazi Party. And that's what you're going to be learning about this week, the beginning of the Nazi Party in Germany. And the Nazis first came into being in the wake of the Treaty of Versailles. What you see here on this page are 10 points from what is called the Nazi Party's platform, their political platform, where they state the things they believe in and what their goals are. And you'll notice one of them, number 2, is the abolition of the Treaty of Versailles. This was one of the things that the Nazis really, really spoke about a lot, that the Treaty of Versailles was a travesty of justice, was an insult to Germany. The idea that Germany was forced to accept the blame for the war was something that all Germans should be enraged by. And so the Nazis initially tried to increase their political power and popularity by really hammering home that issue. It was not the only issue they would hammer home. You'll see here there are a lot of things in the Nazi Party platform that will be sort of foreshadowing of what they will become later on. You can see, German blood is a requirement for German citizenship. Non-citizens can live in Germany only as foreigners. I believe there's one here that says no Jew can be a citizen of Germany. Newspapers should be published in the German language. So you've got a lot of stuff here that foreshadows what they're going to become later on. Here's a quick snapshot of pre- and post-war Germany. And you'll notice this is a map of Europe in 1914. Here's a map of Europe in 1919. You have a lot of new nations that are created, and they're actually created as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. You will notice that Germany itself is reduced significantly in size from what it had been in 1914. Germany loses a tremendous amount of its international power as a result of being defeated in the war. And this, as I said before, contributes to the rise of the Nazi Party. So we've already mentioned a couple of things, but I'm going to add a little bit of context here. After World War One, Germany's economy was devastated. You'll learn a little bit more about that this week. Germany would go through about a 6-7 year period after the war of just economic chaos. It would also have a brand new government. Up until World War One, Germany had been ruled by effectively a king. The German word for that was the word Kaiser. The Kaiser's name was Wilhelm II. It was an imperial form of government. After World War One, they'll replace that form of government with a republic, not all that different from the United States in a lot of ways. They're going to attempt to put into place a more democratic system. But it's a system that a lot of Germans feel like is being forced on them. It's a system that's trying to establish itself in the midst of just complete economic post war chaos. And groups like the Nazis are looking to exploit that chaos. So, who were the Nazis? As I said before, they were one of many social groups forming after World War One. They are not the only one, and they were pretty small for a long period of time. They didn't have a lot of members, but their members were very visible in the streets of Germany. They were made up mainly of World War One veterans. Um, and they sort of would go around blaming other groups, communists and Jews, for destroying Germany. They would always talk about who was to blame. They say, here are the groups to blame for your troubles. We're the ones who are going to bring you out of those troubles and bring you back. So for the Nazis, their major issues were restoring German greatness, anger over the loss in World War One, fury over the Treaty of Versailles, and they would essentially make their presence felt by having a physical presence in the streets. This is a picture of what was known as the Nazi SA, that was nicknamed some people as the Brown Shirts. They were effectively a paramilitary organization. They were not an official part of the German army, but they were members of the Nazi party. But they would dress themselves up like soldiers. They essentially were the visible muscle of the Nazi party. And they would be in the streets of German towns and cities, basically cutting a physically intimidating presence and occasionally using violence and intimidation to silence opposition. Now, as you probably already know, the person who would emerge as the most important leader of the Nazi Party was Adolf Hitler. As you'll learn this week, he was a World War One veteran. He has a very interesting and confusing biography. You'll learn that this week. But he was a World War One veteran, and he was a very angry World War One veteran. He actually first is introduced to the Nazis as a spy. He was asked to spy on the Nazis. He spies on them, and according to his own account, he is so taken by their message, he actually joins them. And within a year, he will emerge as their face. He was a very, very compelling public figure. He spoke with a lot of anger and passion that appealed to a lot of people. And he quickly emerges as the leader of the party. Having said all that, what you see here in this chart here is the representation in different political parties in Germany in the 1920s. And this is in 1928. And you'll notice that the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, represented a very small percentage of the total number of people who had seats in political offices in the German government. So throughout the 1920s, the Nazis remained a relatively small political force in Germany. That would change, as I'm sure many of you have already figured out. Now, by contrast, the United States after World War One went into a period of economic prosperity, whereas Germany was in collapse and chaos. The United States in the 1920s seemed to be growing, 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 growing. Just want to briefly mention some forces that shaped the American decade in the 1920s. One of them is post-war fear, and you've already learned about this a little bit in our immigration unit. You know that in the early 1920s, we set into place very strict quotas on immigration. That was, to a large degree, influenced by the fear of foreigners that came out of World War One. You can see our cartoon here where you have a foreigner with a bomb in his hand looking to blow up the Statue of Liberty. You have cartoons like this showing fears of what will happen to America under communism. So you've got in the United States after the war xenophobia that will lead to changes in immigration law. You also had the expansion of a lot of industries, including the automobile industry. I've shown you this picture already. It was in my screencast last week. The automobile industry was a huge industry in the 1920s. Short little fact. In 1905, the typical car cost $4,000. By 1925, the typical Model T Ford cost $300. The transformation that this would lead to was, I don't have enough time to explain all of it, but one little fact I'll give you now is up until the turn of the 20th century, most Americans never traveled more than 30 miles from their home in their entire lives. Thanks to the automobile, people could do that on almost a regular basis. So it's really going to transform, among other things, mobility in American society. You also have the rise of what is known as the stock market. And this is a picture of the stock market, and this is going to be a focus of your reading. We'll come back to this again next week. Americans are going to invest in stocks as they never have before. And I will come back next week and talk a little bit more about stocks, what it means to invest in stock, and why the stock market crashed in 1929, and how that led eventually to the Great Depression, although the stock market crash did not necessarily cause the Great Depression. This week, you're going to be learning a little bit more about the Treaty of Versailles and about America and Germany in the 1920s. Give you a sense of these two different nations in this post-war world. Anyway, that's all for now. The assignments will be up on Canvas this week. Email me if you have any questions, and I hope you have a good week, folks.